Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. Papa Boris here, making a somewhat unusual video for Pathfinder Adventures. In this video, I'd like to review the new alternate characters, or equipment sets, as Obsidian is calling them, that have just been released with the latest update, which also included the 6th adventure, Spires of Shalast, or Halast, or whatever it's pronounced, finishing officially the game. Although, of course, it's terribly buggy, so it's not exactly finished yet, but you get the idea. Anyway, to get these, you go to Characters in the store, and then now next to all the original characters like, Seoni and stuff, you got the Frostfire Seoni and stuff like that. So I'm gonna also on the screen, you can see on the right hand side, have the web page. This is in the Pathfinder Adventures forum, the announcements and news, which summarizes all of the things that are different between these alternate characters compared to the originals. Because if you look into the store, you actually see that while you can see more and look at the character fully, it doesn't actually tell you what is different, making that a little bit more of a tedious process. So we're going to have both things up at the same time. And what I found while reviewing these characters is that there's basically 3 categories they fall in. There's the poop category, which is like, this character sucks. It's so bad that even if you gave it to me for free, I would never play with this character. It's just awful. There's the category, or alternately called the meh category. This is where it's fine, maybe even a little bit better than the original, but you can see these characters are friggin' balls-ass expensive. It's either 6,000 gold or 7,000 gold for these alternates, so, it's one of those things where unless you are just rolling in riches, you probably don't actually want to buy the ones unless they're really worth it. And by the way, there seems to be no rhyme or reason to the pricing. It's not like the character add-on characters are 7 and the other ones are 6. Like Scholar's a base character, but he's 7,000, and Amiri's an expansion character, and she's 6,000. So I don't know exactly how these prices were determined, but anyway, they're all either 6 or 7,000 gold. So the meh category is just like, this character is maybe a little bit better, or fine, or different in some way, but just not really worth spending your gold on. And then, of course, there's the WoW category. So that's the category of characters that are really good and I actually recommend getting because they offer some significant mechanical benefits compared to the originals. So what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to go down the list in the store. Instead, I'm going to go down the list in the webpage. And so we're going to start with Shadow Merisiel. And this one squarely falls into the meh category. Overall, a little bit better than the original Rogue, or a little bit different at least, for some variety, but just not really worth it. So let's start with the stat differences. So Strength goes down from a D8 to a D6, and Wisdom goes up to a D8 from a D6. Now, normally Wisdom is better than Strength, so normally this is like a slight upgrade to a character, but it's not crazy or anything. And for Merisiel, Strength does have some benefits. I mean, if you watched my party with Merisiel, you know that sometimes as the Rogue, you definitely end up punching things with your face, and so D8 ends up being helpful to have for Strength. Furthermore, some bows, if you play with weapon proficiency, do go off of your Strength die. So again, it's useful in that particular case to have a higher Strength. D8's useful, though, I mean, don't get me wrong, for Wisdom, because there's a lot of Wisdom checks throughout the game, so it's kind of a wash. It's not that big of a deal. Then we have some skill changes. Now, this is definitely a downgrade. Stealth is incredibly rare, and Acrobatics is quite common, especially later in the adventure, when a lot of your ability to block auto damage from henchmen and villains depends on making a really tough Acrobatics check. Not a big deal, though, by any means. It's not a big deal, but definitely this is a slight downgrade. Then we have the change to allies and blessings. And this is a little bit weird, by the way. There's a typo here. It's 5, not 3, up from 4. So you can now have one more blessing and one less ally than before, considering that most of the time you're going to be using allies to explore, and blessings can be used to explore, but are generally better. I'd say that is a slight upgrade. And finally, her sneak attack ability, the D6, so you can recharge your card to add a D6 to your combat check if you're alone, or you can discard a card to add 2d6 to a combat check if you're alone at the location. Now adds +1, and that's definitely a nice upgrade. Worth 6,000 gold? Probably not. That's why she's in the meh category, but I think because everything else is more or less a wash for this character, just getting a straight +1 on your sneak attack is definitely better than the original Merisiel was. So, meh for me, but certainly not worse than the original. Next up is Amiri, who gets, who gets a survivalist version. Alright, so let's go ahead and scroll down here. Pop open Amiri, there we go. She costs only 6,000 gold, even though she's from the adventure add-on, or the character add-on, so I'm not exactly sure why. So starting with stats, so her strength, starting with stats, her constitution goes up to a D10 and charisma goes down to a D4. this is pretty much just irrelevant. I mean, yeah, Constitution's nice. She's more likely to make Constitution checks than Charisma checks, so it's a slight increase, but it's pretty insignificant. We have this change here, which I'd say is a slight benefit. So weapons go down from 5 to 4, and allies go up from 2 to 3, which is decent because allies can give her extra explorations, and she's guaranteed to start with a weapon anyhow. Now, if you watched me in playing my game, you know that sometimes Amiri does end up kind of wanting a weapon from her deck, but it's not that big of a deal. So this is definitely a slight upgrade, having an extra explorer in your deck. Now, the Barbarian Rage is pretty nifty. What this can do now is, in addition to being used for strength, melee, and constitution checks, Amiri can now use this for survival checks, and that's really good because there are quite a few survival checks in the game, especially in the later scenarios. Survival becomes quite common. In fact, there's one scenario in Adventure Deck 6 where like everybody has to make ridiculous survival checks all the time, and so her being able to bury a card to give herself a D10 plus change on survival is good. Now, that overall gives Amiri a meh rating from me. Certainly an upgrade compared to the original Amiri, but survival is still, in the grand scheme of things, not like that amazing, and it's just kind of slight upgrades all around, so I don't know if it's worth 6,000 gold. Again, if you're swimming in gold, just like Merisiel, certainly a good purchase, just, it's not like mind-blowing. Now let's take a look at Ezrin, who now becomes a scholar. So Ezrin's dexterity goes down from D6 to a D4, and his wisdom goes up from a D8 to a D10. I'd say overall this is an upgrade, although you do need dexterity sometimes for barrier checks. For the most part, it doesn't really affect Ezrin's combat because he's not going to be fighting things with his hands anyway, or fighting things with bows anyway. I mean, you can use a bow, but he has a D6 for strength, so you can just as well use like a club or something. And a wisdom is a definitely better die than dexterity for Ezrin because when he encounters divine spells, he's now more likely to pick them up, rolling a D10 instead of a D8, and that gives him an extra explore, plus occasionally picks up a good divine spell for another divine character in your party. Now, we have a pretty big change on skills. His arcane goes down by 1, and his knowledge goes up by 1. And I've seen people be like, oh, knowledge. I don't know, guys. I don't know what game you're playing. Knowledge is a stupid skill. It's almost completely worthless. There's like a handful of locations. Not even a handful. There's like 2 locations that close with knowledge. Every once in a blue moon, you may make a knowledge check. So this is pretty immaterial. But arcane going down to +1 is pretty huge because that's all of his checks. That's all of his closing checks, all of his recharge checks, all of his combat checks, all of his checks to pick up spells. I mean, everything is now to -1. So this is definitely a big downgrade compared to the stat changes, which are a minor upgrade. However, even though I've got really animated talking about this huge downgrade, I'm still going to give Ezrin a wow rating because check out what happens here. His weapons go down to 0 and his items go up to 4. So down 1 for the weapons, up 1 for the item. And now this is amazing because Ezrin just never wants a goddamn weapon. Like if you watch my game, you know that you just never want to see the weapon in your hand. It's always totally worthless. You never want to use it for combat. It's just terrible. So just getting rid of it is a huge upgrade. Essentially, giving him an extra item, which actually is useful. Now if you're playing the paper version of the game, items do kind of crap out eventually. There's just only so many good ones, but if you're playing the digital version and you're opening any chests, you got those orbs in there that are pretty common, which add damage. Items, having an extra one is definitely nice. And one thing that nobody's mentioned in their analysis yet, of the people who have written stuff on the forums, is that the card feats have not changed. So it's not like, the designers kept his maximum items at 6, but just gave him an extra item to start. These 3 slots that are present initially are still there when Ezrin's starting items go up by 4, which means that his maximum number of items increases by 1 as well, and that's really good, again, in the digital version where there's plenty of good items to be had. On top of that, his spellbook has been changed, so now when he plays an arcane spell, let me actually show you this power here, this augmented spellbook. When you play an arcane spell, you can look at the top card of your deck, and if it's a spell, you can add it to your hand. Well, now it's a spell or an item that has the magic trait. Guys, that's most of your deck. I mean, a typical Ezrin is going to definitely max out spells, so 11 spells, probably going to max out items. Like, when I'm playing, I put my 6 card feats, spells and items. Allies, you can do, it's totally fine to get some extra explorers if you want that in there, but, like, even if, let's say, you put, like, 2 into allies, 1 into items, and then 3 into spells, you're going to have a 21 card deck, of which 16 of the cards are spells or magic items. So you're going to be I mean, you're almost always going to be drawing an extra card every single time you play an arcane spell. So that is a crazy upgrade. I mean, if you watch me play, you know that there's tons of times where, like, I'll cast a spell and I'll see, like, you know, the Wand of Enervation is the next card in my deck, or something like that I'd really want to have right now, but I can't because his ability only picks up spells. So having this to pick up items, it's really good. It's worth the arcane downgrade, in my opinion, because it starts out, that's really rough, but eventually, you know, a -1, the more that you put skill feats into intelligence and the better the spells get, the less relevant the -1 becomes. But having more items, having no weapon in your deck, and getting to draw an item at the top of your deck whenever you play a spell, these are huge things that are going to affect you throughout the entire adventure. So Ezrin gets a WoW rating from me, and I think he's probably the best designed alternate character of the bunch, just because the designers gave him a significant downgrade, but made up for it with really cool upgrades, and so I feel like this guy really captures the spirit of these character alts and what they should be doing. And of course, he's one of the expensive ones, popping in at 7,000 gold. Okay, next up, let's take a look at Harsk. Now, Harsk, I don't know, somebody was just smoking some crack. They got meth over there in Obsidian land. I don't know what the hell, who was thinking what when they made this guy. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if he gets nerfed, but this is just fucking bananas. So his stat upgrades are fantastic. His D12 in Constitution is just always an eyesore, so cutting it down to a D10 is fine. Cutting Fortitude down is totally fine. But Wisdom going up to D8 is fantastic, because Harsk always wanted that. He's got skills in the Wisdom category. He has Perception and Survival in here, so getting a bigger die is really good. And his Survival, which is, again, one of the most important skills in the game, especially later on, goes up from +2 to +3, so this is just fantastic. He loses a weapon, but again, just like with Amiri, who cares? And he recharges his hand so fast anyway, thanks to his sniper power, that it doesn't even matter that if you're one weapon short. And he gets an extra ally to start with, which is great, so it's an extra explore. And then now it all would have been fine, but for some reason, he also gets a bigger starting hand size. And I don't know exactly why they did that, but it's just stupendously awesome. Just having a bigger hand size is amazing. In fact, I don't even know like how his power feats are supposed to work, because you'll notice now he only has 3 power feats available. I mean, I'm not going to say it's broken, but it's a little bit stupid. So basically, the 3 power feats you get before you pick up a roll for Harsk are now going to have to go into Scout Ahead and Sniper Shot. So, you know, now that I think about it, I guess it's not that huge in the long term, because you're eventually going to waste a power feat on this really, really stupid thing that is completely worthless, whereas normally you would have put a power feat to upping your hand size. But still, the stat and skill and cards are all upgrades, and then on top of that, until you get your 3rd power feat in Adventure 3, I believe, is when you get your 3rd one, having an extra hand size is really fantastic. So Harsk definitely gets a wow for me, even if part of that is sort of short term. Okay, next up, let's take a look at Kyra, one of the 2 characters you get for free when you download the digital version. So she has a strength boost from D6 to a D8, and a melee boost from 2 to +3. Now, this is fantastic, because with Kyra, although she is a divine character, and you can, I suppose, play her as a divine caster using her usually D12 wisdom and then divine wisdom +2, it doesn't really work very well, because she only starts with 3 spells. She can only have 5, and if you're, you know, having like 4 combat spells or something, you're not really going to do much of anything else with your spells. And on top of that, all these weapons are totally useless. Shadow or Sunwrought Kyra goes up from 2 to 3, but still, even if you're playing regular Kyra, she starts with 2 weapons. If you're going for her as a divine caster, it's not going to work, because you're going to have these 2 weapons that are just totally useless. On top of that, there's not that many good divine spells. There's just the Holy Light, if you're lucky enough to pick that up, and then that's pretty much it. Like, there's really nothing in the divine category for combat for some reason in this game. So, for that reason, you pretty much always want to play Kyra as a melee character. It's just the better way to play her, and getting a D8 strength and a D3 melee up from D6 and D2 is huge. That's a +2 on all of her combat rolls. Just for reference, Valeros has D10 strength and then melee +3, so she's only 1 down from the warrior. With this, she actually surpasses the paladin in melee combat ability, so that's crazy good. Now, yes, losing a die in wisdom is a negative, but it is more than made up for by this crazy benefit to her melee power. Then she has a Fortitude downgrade, which is like, who cares? Starting weapons go up, which is good because as a melee character without a favored card type of weapon, Kyra really wants to have an extra weapon floating around in her deck, so she's more likely to find it. And she loses an armor, which who gives a shit because armor's the crappiest stuff. So this would be enough to get a WoW rating from me as it is. On top of that, though, her Undead Lore ability, which gives her an extra 1d8 when facing undead, goes up to a 1d8 plus 1 to start, which is not that relevant. It's not that big of a deal, but it does pop up occasionally and it does feel good, so it's definitely an upgrade. So Kyra gets an enthusiastic WoW for me because she's always wanted to be a melee character, and now she actually doesn't suck as one. Next up, let's take a look at Lem, our halfling bard, who becomes a lieutenant. So, Lem gets an extra dexterity die and loses a wisdom die. You're going to probably use a crossbow with Lem, although I believe that making a blaster Lem is the way to go, because you're going to be wanting to put points into charisma anyway. Still, you're probably going to have to use your crossbow sometime, so getting an extra die there and an effective +1 on all your ranged combat checks is nice. Losing the wisdom sucks, but his wisdom was bad to begin with, so you never really wanted to rely on him for wisdom anyway. And if he encounters a divine spell, he's using charisma for that, because of course his divine is located inside of charisma. So it's not that big of a deal for Lem in particular to lose a wisdom die, even though wisdom is generally the best stat in the game, just because of his divines, being here under charisma. It's not that big of a deal. Now, as diplomacy goes down to +2 from +3, it's not that big of a deal though, because it's still really good, and you're still going to be putting points in charisma. So it's certainly a penalty, but it's not that big of a deal. And he starts with light armor and gets the ability to upgrade to heavy armor, which who gives a shit. So all in all, this guy's a pretty clear. His knowledge goes up to +4 from +3. Whoop-de friggin' do. So it's better than the original Lem for sure, because of that higher dexterity and everything else being kind of irrelevant. But this is a resounding meh, especially since he for some reason cost 7,000 gold. The other one that we saw that was 7,000 was Ezrin, who was just ridiculously incredible. But Lem, I don't see this price being justified in the slightest. These are just all upgrades, but it doesn't matter that much. So an enthusiastic meh from this guy. Let's take a look at Linney next, our gnome druid. Where is she? Down here. Yep. All right. So we got our, well, this actually says feral Linney in the post, but it says wild Linney in the app. I don't know who's right. I don't really care. So her dexterity goes up to a d8 and her charisma goes down to a d6. Don't really care. I mean, I guess if you're using ranged weapons, this matters a little bit, but it's not that significant. I will say, though, as a disclaimer, some people swear by using a weapon-based Linney, and so if you do that, actually could make a slight benefit to you, but it's not that significant to me. Her knowledge goes down and her survival goes up. Now we've been talking about how survival is a really good skill. However, I'm going to go ahead and say this is not that big of a deal, though, because if you look, Linney's going to be putting all of her stat points into wisdom for her divine spells for the most part. So she's already, and she also has their animal companions, which eventually will reveal for a d4 plus 4. So she's going to be throwing something crazy like a d10 plus a d4 plus 8 even before you factor in the survival bonus. So for her in particular, this is not that relevant. Now her starting items go down by 1, and that blows dickens. So now Linney can only ever have 3 items rather than 4, because she normally starts with 2 items and can get 2 card feats here. And allies going up is definitely good, because that starting with an extra ally is nice. It's rechargeable exploration, plus the more allies that you have in your deck, the more likely that you are to find another animal if you end up spending one of your animals to recharge. So it's definitely good to get an extra ally at the start, but I really hate losing this item because Linney just has a hard enough time as it is holding on to the good items that she finds. So I don't like that. And then Beast Form is nifty. Instead of adding a d10, it now adds a d12, but this is not an ability that I use very often. Just to show you real quick what that is. It's when you make a strength or a dexterity check, you can discard a card to make it a d10 instead of its normal value, which normally would be a d4 for strength and a d6, or if you're playing feral Linney, a d8 for dexterity. So now you get a d12, which is definitely, an upgrade, but it's not a skill that you want to be using much because you really don't want to be discarding those cards. So all in all, for me, Linney is somewhere between a meh and a poop. I personally would never play as this feral Linney because I really do not like losing an item, which is a card area that Linney was really struggling with already, and none of the other stuff matters to me. That said, for players who like to weaponize Linney and give her a crossbow, they might appreciate having the extra d8, and for people who are not putting their card feats into items, if they just don't care for some reason, and instead are just maxing out their allies, having even more allies would definitely be appealing to them. So I acknowledge that this is one place where it's not necessarily an objective call that I'm making, just my personal opinion. So for me, it's a poop. For you, it might be a meh. So that's why I'm rating her somewhere in between. All right, let's take a look at everybody's favorite monk, and this is going to be an interesting one. Painted Sajan. I don't know why that's special. I mean, he could have just put paint on his face to begin with and been the same guy, so I don't know why this is a big deal. But anyway, let's take a look at his stuff. So his wisdom goes down from a d8 to a d6, and his charisma goes up from a d6 to a d8, and that's definitely just terrible, because wisdom, like I said, is the most generally useful stat in the game, and so just losing a die of that is pretty bad. And then charisma going up is pretty irrelevant. Like, who was ever relying on Sajan for charisma? So I don't know. I guess he painted his face and now is stupider but more handsome, and whatever. I guess in the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal that he's losing a wisdom die. Like, yes, it's the best stat, but it's not like a devastating blow, like, you know, Ezrin losing a point of arcane or something. But it's annoying, so this is definitely a slight downgrade with these stats. Now, acrobatics and fortitude change, and this is a slight upgrade because acrobatics does come up a lot, like I've said before. You do use acrobatics a lot later in the game to avoid damage from villains and henchmen, and so Sajan getting that up even higher is definitely nice. Fortitude, on the other hand, it's like, who cares? Fortitude does also sometimes determine your ability to dodge damage, but here's the thing. Sajan's never putting points into Constitution, so he was never going to make those checks anyway, whereas he's going to have a maxed out dexterity, so he always had a shot at those acrobatics checks, and now his shot's a little bit better. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, Boris, wait a minute. What about, you know, Drunken Master Sajan, who does this thing where when you play a boon that has a liquid trait, succeeded a Fortitude 6 check to recharge instead of banishing it? Well, I've written about this before, and I don't know if I've actually talked about this in my Let's Plays, but I think this is just a stupid roll card. Not a stupid roll card. This is the roll card I picked, but this is a stupid power, and it's just not worth bothering with because there's not enough good potions in the game. That being said, if you are someone who goes after this, well, congratulations. That just got worse now because it already kind of sucks to, you know, but it already kind of sucks to be putting points into Constitution, but now your ability to use this bad power has become even less effective with Fortitude going down. So this is one of those things where if you're someone who, like me, who doesn't care, then it's a non-issue, but if you're someone who cares, then it's a negative. So Fortitude going down by 1, you know, can be bad or good, or it can be irrelevant or bad, depending on your preferences. He also gets the craft skill, giving him the weird distinction of being the only character in the game with the craft skill, but it's pretty unimportant. There's not that much stuff that you really care about picking up with craft that you can pick up with craft, so it's not that big of a deal. So if we take stock of where he's been at, losing the wisdom, kind of bad, losing the acrobatics, or getting the acrobatics, kind of good, losing the fortitude, either relevant or bad, depending on where you stand on the Drunken Master Sajan's potion recharging path. Now, this is where things get weird. He starts with a weapon. Normally, he does not have any weapons. This time, he starts with one, and he loses an ally. And I'm going to go ahead and call this bad, because allies give him extra explores, or you can use rechargeable allies to boost your combat checks further, and weapons are something that a Sajan I don't really think you want to be using. That said, clearly the people who originally made this game, the folks at Paizo, thought that maybe some people would want to use weapons for Sajan, and some people do. Sajan has this Zen Archer role, which is all about picking up weapon proficiency, and then, you know, using ranged weapons. I think this is just a really bad way to go, and mechanically inferior to the other role card. So I guess some people would want a weapon to start with. You know, you can keep a crossbow in your hand and get like an extra d8 on your combat checks. But I think that's bad. I don't think you want to do that. And I also think that losing an ally, which loses you an Explore, is also bad. So I think this is just bad. So for me, Sajan's going to go ahead and get a poop rating. Nothing really matters that much, but this card change sucks. So that's just a negative for me all in all, even if I got this guy for free, I would never use him. That said, I can see how some people who like to use weaponized Sajan would like to get weapons earlier on, so maybe they would be excited, you know, use at your own peril. Next up is Seelah, who is put on a gown and is now looking all formal or something. So she loses a point of constitution and gains a die in intelligence, and this is not particularly relevant for anything. It really doesn't make any difference. Although aesthetically it is appealing, I always thought it sucked that Seelah had a d4 for intelligence. I feel like, I guess there is the trope of paladins being really stupid, but it doesn't really seem to fit her character particularly to be a big old Dumbo. So I like aesthetically evening out these stats, even as I acknowledge that mechanically it just doesn't matter very much. Now she loses a point of melee. So that's bad. Again, that's like all of her combat checks, all of her checks to, pick up weapons, all that stuff goes down by 1 for the rest of the game. Now, you can compensate that a little bit. Obviously, Seelah's going to be putting all of her points into all of her skill feats into strength. So the further the game goes along, the less relevant that becomes. And on top of that, she can always give herself an extra d6 on her check, so you can always choose to make up for that loss if you feel like it. So what crazy thing is Seelah getting to make up for this big loss? Well, her divine skill, which used to be under wisdom, now goes under charisma, which makes a lot of sense because charisma was always her bigger die. And now it just makes sense that the paladin, who's very much a charisma-based character, can do her spell casting out of it. So this improves all of Seelah's checks to recharge cards by 1 on average, and qualitatively, being able to roll a 9 or a 10 is nice because a lot of times when she is recharging a spell, it's a hard roll to make. You're just like, well, let me go for it, but usually you fail. So just being able to roll a higher number can just give her the chance of succeeding at some of those tougher to recharge spells. So all in all, it's pretty good. On top of that, she gets the diplomacy skill, so now granted, +1's not that big of a deal, but this is a nice pickup just because, she's got this charisma that she's now going to be putting skill feats into, and it's going to make her divine better, and she's going to be a decent diplomatizer as well. So that all fits, and it just helps her be a more well-rounded, effective character. She loses an armor card, which is fantastic, because armor's the shittiest card in the game, and she gains an item, which is amazing. So if you look at Seelah normally, Seelah has no items and no ability to gain items. But now she starts with an item, and sure, she cannot improve it any further, because like I said, Obsidian did not change the card feats that were available. So anytime with these alternate characters that you lose a card, that's permanently your maximum number of that card has gone down by 1, and anytime you gain a card at the start, it also means that your maximum number of cards you could ever have is increased by 1. So now Seelah goes from 0 items to 1, and she starts with the 1, and I feel like that's really good, because there are just some items that would be nice to have. Oftentimes when playing as Seelah, I really regret that, I can't give her some random item to hang on to, either for somebody else or just a spyglass for herself to get some more scouting, or just, I guess for her, she scouts for free, but you know what I mean. Just there's always some random little item rolling around that you might like to pick up, and being able for Seelah to hold on to it is good. So even though this doesn't really seem like it's that crazy, I'm going to go ahead and give Seelah a WoW rating. I would definitely like to get her at some point. It sucks that she's 7,000. I think of all the ones that have been WoWs, only Harsk has been 6,000 for some reason. So yeah, I'd like to pick her up. She's very expensive, but it is really cool that now you can allocate your skill feats by putting 4 into strength, 2 into charisma, and actually be pretty decent at divine and diplomacy, and just leave wisdom at your base d8, plus your hero power of flipping a card to get an extra d6. Okay, so Seelah is pretty good. Next, let's take a look at Seoni, our sorceress. She is now Frostfire. Where are you, Seoni? Oh my god, are you near the top? Yeah, there you are. Okay, so Seoni gets an extra d8 in dexterity. Or, sorry, an extra die in dexterity going up to a d10 from d8, which is, I don't know why that matters. I mean, she's clearly never going to use weapons. She's not going to use a crossbow or anything. It's pretty irrelevant. I mean, occasionally the barriers that come up, it's nice, but obviously it's not that great. And her charisma goes down, and that's terrible because, of course, charisma is her main skill. So that's definitely a negative. Now, to compensate for that a little bit, her arcane does go up by 1. So her average arcane roll stays the same. A d10 plus 3 is on average the same as a d12 plus 2. They are both 8.5. Now, there's some differences quantitatively and qualitatively. So quantitatively, when you add blessings and your big die is smaller, you get less of a benefit. So Seoni, this version of Seoni with a blessing is -1 compared to the original Seoni with a blessing. Qualitatively, it is nice to have a higher minimum, though, because a lot of the times you're not really interested in making a big check. You're just hoping you're hoping to avoid a really small roll. And so I think actually in this case, it's worth it, because it's not that often that it really makes a difference when you're already playing a blessing to get an extra +1. But it is pretty common that it's like, oh shoot, I'm rolling a d10, and if I roll a 1, I fail, and that would suck. So like, what do I do to bump that up? So it's really nice that she gets an extra minimum. I think that overall, just as far as Arcane is concerned, it's okay that she loses the Arcane, or the Charisma, because she gains an Arcane, which is the main thing she needs Charisma for. So although this looks bad here, I'd say the Arcane makes up for it. And then so basically she gets like a free d10 in Dexterity, which isn't that big of a deal, but hey, it's an upgrade. Now Diplomacy goes down, which is annoying, because a lot of times you do want those higher minimums on Diplomacy, but all in all, I'd say it's not that big of a deal. Now, on the card front, she loses a blessing and gains a spell. This is freaking fantastic. And again, it's one of those things that I just haven't seen people mention in the forums, which is that when you start with an extra spell, because the card feats have not changed, now Seoni can eventually go up to 7 spells rather than up to 4, or rather than up to 6. And because Seoni has her power, the famous power, of course, of automatically recharging all spells, there is nobody who's ever played Seoni who hasn't wanted to go up an extra spell from 6 to 7, unless I guess they're playing from inside of an insane asylum and are just crazy. So getting an extra spell is fantastic. It's really amazing that Seoni got this. And what she loses for it is a blessing, which is a hit. It's definitely a hit to have one less blessing, to have one less explore. But at the end of the day, it's worth it for her to get an extra spell, because that's just so cool. On top of that, her Arcane Blast is now different. It is called Stormfire Blast, and it adds 2d4 instead of 1d6 and the cold trait. And this is one of those things where, actually, I've just seen people talk about it and be wrong completely. So some people said like, oh, fire is better. Guys, you're not losing the fire trait here. You now have cold on top of fire. So basically, whereas originally this used to be a d6, attack, fire, and magic, it is now 2d4 with attack, cold, fire, and magic. And I think it's supposed to be arcane as well, but whatever, I'm not going to get into that. So now let's talk about the differences. So quantitatively, 2d4 is significantly better than a d6 because it's 5 on average instead of a 3.5. And that's an extra 1.5, and it's a big deal. Qualitatively, it's effective too, because it's increasing your minimum by 1, which is really, really good, and it's giving you less variance. So a 2d4 is only going to roll a 2 1/16 of the time, whereas a 1d6 is going to roll a 2 or less 1/3 of the time. So it's quantitatively and qualitatively significantly better than rolling a 1d6. Now, how about this cold trait? Well, if you encounter a monster that's immune to cold, now you can't use this blast. However, there's not that many of those monsters in the game, and that number goes down even more when you think about how many of those monsters are there in the game that you actually want to use this ability on. You generally don't want to use this ability as Seoni because you're discarding a card, and the later the game goes, the worse it gets. Because, yeah, you can, put power feats in it to give it an extra +1, but it does not keep pace with how hard the monsters, especially the henchmen and villains, get. So you don't really want to be using this all the live long day, so it's just not that likely that this cold is going to make a huge negative difference. It can, however, make a positive difference if there's a monster that is vulnerable to cold or gives you bonuses for using a cold trait. So this is definitely a significant upgrade for Seoni, because most of the time the cold is not going to matter. Sometimes it'll be an improvement, and the 2d4 instead of a 1d6 helps her all the time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give her a WoW rating. I know that may seem a little bit weird, but her arcane power stayed the same because even though the designers dropped her charisma, they upped her arcane. She got an extra spell, which is just ridiculously awesome for this character, and then everything else kind of balances out. On top of that, they made another one of her powers just straight up better. So another WoW character for me. And lastly, let's take a look at Armored Valeros. Now you're seeing armor in the title and thinking, is this gonna suck because armor is just the worst in the game? And the answer is yeah. I do not know what Obsidian was thinking. If honestly, if I saw this and didn't have any context, I'd be like, oh, Obsidian is trolling us. Maybe there's some inside joke where somebody in the company hates Valeros and just wanted to make an alternative that is complete, just totally unabashed shit, and they just made him suck on purpose. That's what I would think. I honestly just cannot fathom how anybody put this together, looked at him, was like, no, yeah, that's a good alternative character. So his dexterity goes down, his constitution goes up, total wash, who gives a shit. Dexterity is a little bit better than constitution, so all in all, it's a slight downgrade. His melee goes down, which is first of all, it's a huge typo here, because it starts at +3, and then they say it's +1, 1. In actuality, it starts at +3 and goes down to +2, but his melee did go down, so now in all of his combat checks, he's 1 down. He gained a Fortitude skill, which nobody gives a shit. He gained an extra armor card, which is just bad. It's not even like neutral, it's just bad. Like, I honestly don't even want the armor in my deck, especially when I already have 3 armors. I don't want a 4th. But on top of that, he loses an ally, so he's losing a useful card that might give him an extra explore, some other ability. So let's take stock. He's 1 down in all of his combat checks. He loses an ally. He gets a card that's worthless. And possibly just downright harmful. He gets skill changes that are mostly a wash, but are a little bit worse, and then he gets a +1, which is a very minor skill, to a skill that doesn't even matter anyway. So this guy gets the one, the only double, you know what, why don't we make it triple poop rating? I mean, if you gave me this guy for free, I would never play with him under any circumstances. And it's not like some of the other characters to whom I gave a poop rating where I was like, oh, well, you know, maybe if you think about it from multiple angles of the issue. Like, no, don't play him. If you think this is good, you're wrong. You're just objectively wrong. Don't play with him. He sucks. If you play with him, you suck. That's all we have to say about Armored Valeros. Let's go ahead and give him, let's go ahead. You know what? Fuck it. Quintuple poop rating for Armored Valeros. All right, everybody, that'll do it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. Feel free to argue with me or chat in the comments below. And once the developers actually fix the game so that it functions, we'll go ahead and continue our series playing Adventure Deck 6. All right, take care, everybody. I'll see you again soon.